February 17, 1943, Luftwaffe, Forward Base, Taganrog. Hauptmann Klaus Hildebrand paced the officer's briefing, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty Russian spring. Maps covered the walls, marked with red pins, where supply depots had mysteriously erupted in flames the previous week. The room hummed with tension as squadron leaders gathered, cigarette smoke hanging in layers beneath the low ceiling. This emergency briefing had been called after 3 consecutive nights of disrupted operation. Ammunition trains delayed, fuel depots burning, and most concerning, pilots reporting spectral aircraft that appeared and vanished before they could be intercepted. Gentlemen, these so-called night witches are nothing more than girls in crop duster, Hildebrand sneered, provoking appreciative laughter. Moscow has become so desperate they're sending women in museum pieces to fight the Luftwaffe. Their Po-2 biplanes belong in a circus, not a war. Wood and canvas against German engineering. He slapped a technical diagram of the antiquated biplane. They drop bombs by hand like children throwing stone. The Führer himself would laugh if he knew we were losing sleep over schoolgirls in flying coffins from 1928. Officers raised schnapps glasses in toast, one mockingly imitating a woman screaming as she plummeted from the sky. What Hauptmann Hildebrand didn't know was that Nadezhda Popova was already airborne at that exact moment, piloting her wooden Po-2 just 20 kilometers away. At 21 years old, the Ukrainian pilot had already completed 515 missions of her eventual 852, dropping over 40 tons of bombs on German position. That night, her target was the very railroad junction supplying Hildebrand's sector. Within hours, his promised reinforcements would burn in twisted wreckage, delayed by 3 critical days. More remarkable than the mission count was her survival. Just the previous week, she had landed with 17 bullet holes in her aircraft, calculating the damage by counting stars visible through her wings when held against the night sky. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, had evolved through painful lessons paid in pilots' lives. During the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe night fighters suffered 22% casualty rates from non-combat factors, pilots freezing to death in open cockpits, colliding in darkness, or crashing during instrument approaches. By 1942, rigid requirements had been established. Enclosed, heated cockpits prevented the 47 freezing deaths recorded in winter 1940. Radio direction finding eliminated the 31 mid-air collisions from 1941. Mandatory parachutes saved 183 pilots who would have otherwise perished. Most critically, speed minimums of 180 mph were established after slower aircraft proved fatally vulnerable to British defences. The Junkers Ju-88 night fighter embodied these requirements perfectly, cruising at 300 megawatt with a crew of 4, equipped with FUG-220 radar and powered by twin engines generating 2,400 horsepower. Between 1940 and 1942, these purpose-built hunters had destroyed 357 British bombers. German confidence wasn't mere arrogance. It was battle-tested superiority codified into engineering requirements proven effective across 2 fronts. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant during her 493rd mission on January 30th, 1943. That night, targeting a German command post near Krasnodar, she deliberately violated every German doctrine. Without radio, she navigated using only landmarks and a pocket watch. Without parachute, she flew just 400 feet above ground, too low to survive, bailing out anyway. Her canvas biplane crawled across the sky at 94 for Mach, barely half the German minimum safe speed. When searchlights caught her, she didn't have the power to escape upward as German pilots would. Instead, she simply cut her engine, gliding in complete silence as gunners fired at her last known position. The bomb, released manually by her navigator, found their target with devastating accuracy. German commanders attributed the success to blind luck, never suspecting they were witnessing Mission 493 of what would eventually become 852 bombing run by a single pilot who rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine established. The Po-2 biplane was derisively called flying kindling or plywood with wings by German pilots who couldn't believe such primitive machines posed threats. Constructed from wood and canvas, the aircraft offered no protection from the brutal Russian winter. Pilots endured -40-degree temperatures in open cockpits. Severe frostbite was common, and breath-forming ice on eyelashes regularly impaired vision. The aircraft lacked equipment Germans considered essential. No radios meant pilots communicated with hand signals illuminated by flashlights. No parachute saved weight, but meant any critical damage was fatal. No armor left pilots and navigators completely exposed to ground fire. The specifications contrast was staggering. 94 mph maximum speed versus the Ju-88's 300 mph. A single M11 engine producing 100 horsepower against German fighters with 2,400 horsepower. An airframe designed in 1928 that was older than most of its pilot. Manufacturing cost of roughly $5,000 compared to the Ju-88's $80,000. Production time of 3 weeks versus 3 months. The ultimate absurdity. Women flying wooden trainers converted to bombers, dropping explosives by hand through a hole cut in the fuselage floor. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into advantages during her 600th mission in April 1943. After taking heavy fire over a German fuel depot in Novorossiysk, she landed to discover 39 bullet holes through her wings and fuselage. Any metal aircraft would have suffered catastrophic structural failure or fuel tank explosion. Instead, the PO2's canvas covering simply allowed bullets to pass through non-critical areas. She later told her squadron commander, "If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, that bullet would have ricocheted until it found me." Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours. By 3 hours later, after hasty repairs with doped fabric patches, she was airborne again for Mission 601. This resilience explained how she could eventually accumulate 852 combat sorties. The wooden construction that Germans mocked was precisely what kept her alive through withering anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed their superior aircraft. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment from August 17, 1942 concluded, "The Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represents a desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortages and declining manufacturing capacity. The wooden construction and primitive equipment render these aircraft extremely vulnerable to all forms of attack and adverse weather conditions. Physics remains immutable. Speed, metal, and modern engineering will always defeat slow, wooden, obsolete designs in combat scenarios. We predict these operations will cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition. Our calculations confirm overwhelming advantages. 3.1 speed ratio enables multiple attack passes. 24.1 horsepower differential ensures vertical maneuver dominance. 15.1 cost efficiency ratio permits acceptable exchange rates, even in worst-case scenarios. We assess these night harassment raids as temporary morale impacts only, primarily sleep disruption, with no serious operational threat to supply lines or command infrastructure. Recommend monitoring, but no priority allocation for special countermeasures. This assessment carried the full authority of Reichsluftfahrtministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German high command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure during her 650th mission on September 5, 1942. That night, she and her navigator destroyed an ammunition train near Mozdok, creating secondary explosions visible 50 kilometers away. By this point, she had conducted over 600 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet aviation history. German logistics officers recorded unexplainable losses that directly contradicted the official assessment, yet doctrine remained unchanged. The disconnect between headquarters analysis and frontline reality grew as supply shortages cascaded through German units, all while official reports minimized the threat of the wooden biplanes piloted by the women they mocked. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error. Their logic seemed sound. A Ju-88 at 300 mph versus a PO2 at 94 mph created a 2x speed advantage that should guarantee easy interception and destruction. What they critically overlooked was that successful interception requires matching speed, not merely exceeding it. The aerodynamic paradox came down to stall speed, the minimum speed at which an aircraft generates sufficient lift to remain controllable. A Junkers Ju-88 stalls at approximately 120 kilometers, meaning any slower, and it crashes. The PO-2, with its large biplane wing area and light weight, operates comfortably at 80 mph and can glide at 60 mph with its engine off. This created an impossible scenario for German interceptors. They must either fly past the Soviet biplanes too fast to effectively engage, or slow down and risk catastrophic stall. There existed no middle ground. This wasn't theoretical. It happened repeatedly. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted to intercept a lone PO-2. He reduced speed to 130 mph, the absolute minimum his Messerschmitt could sustain, while the Soviet pilot throttled back to a 70 mph glide. Schmidt's aircraft immediately showed stall warning, buffeting controls, and wing shudder indicating imminent loss of lift. He was forced to abort the intercept and reported target speed below minimum engagement threshold. Aircraft limitations prevent effective engagement of slow-moving biplane formation. Wogan, understanding this physics, made Nadezhda Popova untouchable during her 734th mission in January 1943. While dropping mines on a river crossing near Krasnodar, she detected a German night fighter by its exhaust flames. She immediately throttled to minimum power and descended to treetop level, where ground turbulence helped maintain lift at reduced airspeed. The German pilot made 4 separate passes, overshooting each time at speeds too high for accurate gunnery. On his final attempt, he approached dangerously close to stall speed, his wings visibly wobbling as lift became unstable, before he was forced to abandon the intercept or crash. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions, proved the PO-2's slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed. And Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots was only the first of 3 advantages the night witches possess. German fighter design philosophy had been optimized for intercepting fast bombers like the Soviet Ilfar and PE-2, which cruised at speeds exceeding 250 mph. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter were engineered to chase target, not match their speed in slow flight regime. This created an insurmountable physics problem. German interceptors had to maintain a minimum airspeed of approximately 120 mph, or literally fall from the sky. At their optimal cruising speed of 300 mph, overshooting the target was inevitable. Even slowing to 150 mph brought them dangerously close to their stall threshold, creating unstable flight conditions. Meanwhile, the PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 mph and could glide silently at 60 mph, placing it squarely in an untouchable zone. German pilots, trained for high-speed pursuit rather than precision slow-speed engagement, faced a target acquisition window of just 2 to 3 seconds. At speed differentials exceeding 200 mph, achieving weapons lock proved mathematically impossible. On October 2, 1942, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 581st mission while targeting a German motorized column near Mozdok. Approaching her target at 100 feet, she detected a Messerschmitt Bf-110 by the distinctive twin-engine sound cutting through the night. Her response was immediate. She throttled back to minimum power, reducing her airspeed to barely 65 meters and descending to just 200 feet above the roadway. The German fighter made 4 successive passes, overshooting each time with increasing frustration. On the 3rd pass, Popova could clearly see the pilot's silhouette as he executed a dangerously steep bank, wings wobbling as he approached stall speed, trying to tighten his turn radius. Each failed pass gave her precious seconds to adjust course toward the target. She completed her bombing run, while the German fighter burned fuel in futile intercept attempts. This tactic, perfected over hundreds of missions toward her eventual 852, ensured the target was destroyed while her aircraft returned safely. The German pilot later reported, target evasion successful despite multiple engagement attempts, a technical euphemism for complete failure against what should have been an easy kill. The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the PO2's greatest vulnerability, its primitive construction material. The physics of bullet impact created an unexpected paradox. In metal aircraft, a bullet striking aluminum skin creates shrapnel, then ricochets inside the fuselage, a lethal pinball potentially striking fuel line, hydraulics, or crew. German ammunition had been specifically designed for metal targets, with explosive rounds and incendiary tracers, engineered to maximize damage against aluminum airframe. Even armor-piercing rounds wasted energy penetrating non-existent armor. But in canvas aircraft, bullets simply passed through the fabric, exited the opposite side, and continued their trajectory without transferring energy or creating secondary damage. The wooden frame suffered only clean holes unless a bullet directly struck a structural spar, an unlikely occurrence given the sparse construction. Vital system, engine, fuel tank, and crew occupied just 15% of the aircraft's total volume, presenting minimal target area. More remarkably, canvas tears barely affected aerodynamics at such low speeds. Repairs required only fabric patches and dope, completed in under 30 minutes, compared to metal welding requiring specialized equipment and hours of work. German pilots increasingly reported hitting the Soviet biplanes without achieving kills. Bullets passed through without observable effect. During her 713th mission on March 23, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitive. Attacking a German logistics depot near Krasnodar, she flew directly through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Upon landing, ground crews counted 67 bullet holes, 42 through the upper wing alone, 12 in the lower wing, 8 through the fuselage, and 5 through the tail surfaces. One bullet had passed through her cockpit just centimeters from her right shoulder. Another had severed a control cable that her navigator temporarily repaired in flight. The regiment's chief mechanic, examining the damage, declared it would require 3 days of repairs for a metal aircraft. Instead, within 90 minutes, the PO2 was patched and airworthy. Popova flew 4 more missions that same night in the bullet-riddled aircraft. When a visiting IL-2 pilot expressed disbelief at flying such a damaged plane, she reportedly replied, "In your metal coffin, I would be dead. In my plywood classroom, I am merely ventilated." This resilience enabled her to accumulate 852 missions while flying through conditions that would have destroyed supposedly superior aircraft. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale. German air defense systems relied heavily on acoustic detection, with sophisticated sound-ranging equipment triangulating engine noise to direct searchlights and anti-aircraft battery. Their standard procedure followed a predictable sequence: detect engine sound, activate searchlights, commence anti-aircraft fire, and finally, scramble interceptors. The Night Witches discovered a counterintuitive tactic that rendered this entire system obsolete. They would approach at approximately 8,000 feet with engines at full throttle, deliberately loud enough for Germans to hear and prepare defenses. Then, at roughly 3,000 feet from the target, they would completely idle their engines and enter a silent glide. The PO2's glide ratio of approximately 1:10 meant they lost only 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward travel. From 3,000 feet, this provided nearly 30,000 feet of gliding distance, about 5.6 miles. At their 60 mph glide speed, this created 5.6 minutes of completely silent approach. The only sound was the gentle whisper of wind through canvas wing, virtually undetectable against ambient noise. The psychological effect on German troops was profound. They would hear approaching aircraft, prepare defenses, then experience eerie silence, followed by unexpected explosions from an invisible enemy. On the night of July 25, 1943, Nadezhda Popova used this silent approach technique during her record-setting 18th sortie that night. Her target was the German regional headquarters near Taganrog, the very command center where Hauptmann Hildebrand had dismissed the Night Witches months earlier. Approaching from the northeast, she deliberately flew with her engine at full power until German searchlights activate and anti-aircraft batteries began firing wildly at empty sky. At precisely 2,800 feet, she cut her engine completely. The sudden silence was so absolute she could hear German soldiers calling to each other on the ground below. "Where are the planes? Do you see them?" Gliding directly over the command post while Germans futilely swept searchlights through empty sectors of sky, she released her bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The explosions illuminated the faces of soldiers who had been looking in entirely wrong direction. She only restarted her engine after clearing the target area by over a mile. She would repeat this silent approach technique on hundreds of her 852 missions, later telling a war correspondent, "We were ghosts, they couldn't fight. They feared the silence more than the bomb, because silence meant we could be anywhere above them, and they never knew where death would fall." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality. The Ju-88 night fighter boasted impressive specifications: 300 mph top speed, twin engines generating 2,400 horsepower, advanced FUG-220 radar, comprehensive radio suite, armored cockpit, and a crew of 4 specialists. Each aircraft cost approximately 200,000 Reichsmarks, $80,000, required 3 months to build, and demanded skilled labor and precision manufacturing throughout production. Yet these technical advantages translated into surprisingly limited operational effectiveness. German night fighter crews typically flew only 1-2 sorties per night maximum. Between missions, aircraft required 3 to 4 hours of maintenance, systems checks, refueling, rearming, and crew rest period. 4-man crews experienced significant fatigue, coordinating complex intercept operations in high-stress environments. The average Ju-88 night fighter completed only 40 to 60 missions before loss or crew rotation, with a survival rate of approximately 60%. Many were lost to weather, navigation errors, and mechanical failures rather than actual combat. In stark contrast, the PO2 biplanes presented primitive specifications: 94 mph maximum speed, single engine producing 100 horsepower, no radar, no radio, no armor, and a crew of just 2 women. Each aircraft cost roughly 12,000 rubles, $5,000, required only 3 weeks to build, and needed minimal skilled labor. Yet these inferior aircraft demonstrated dramatically higher operational tempo. Night Witch crews routinely flew 8 to 18 sorties per night. Maintenance between missions took just 7 minutes total, 4 minutes for refueling, and 3 minutes to reload bomb. 2-woman crews who had flown together hundreds of times developed near-telepathic coordination. The average Night Witch pilot completed 800 to 1,000 missions during her service, with an astonishing survival rate of 96.8%. The paradox became painfully clear. More expensive, sophisticated aircraft yielded lower operational effectiveness, while simpler, cheaper aircraft delivered higher operational effectiveness. What Germans considered technological advantage became logistical disadvantage in actual combat conditions. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record. On the night of August 10, 1943, she flew her famous 18 missions in a single night, starting at 2200 hours and ending at 0530 hours the following morning. Each complete cycle, flying to target, dropping bombs, returning to base, refueling, reloading, and launching again, took an average of 25 minutes. Her ground crew became so efficient that mechanics could prepare her aircraft faster than she could walk from debriefing to the cockpit. During those 18 sorties, she dropped approximately 2.7 tons of bombs, targeting 5 ammunition dumps, 3 barracks, 4 vehicle parks, 2 command posts, and various other German positions. German casualties from her actions that night were estimated at 138 personnel and 23 vehicles. For comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot, Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen, flew a maximum of 4 sorties in one night, considered an extraordinary achievement. By this point in the war, her march toward 852 missions was becoming legendary even among German soldiers, who began associating the distinctive sound of PO2 engines with imminent danger. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern in resource expenditure. German costs attempting to stop the Night Witches were becoming strategically significant. Anti-aircraft batteries fired over 2 million rounds specifically targeting Night Witch aircraft. At an average cost of 50 Reichsmarks per AA shell, this represented 100 million Reichsmarks, approximately $40 million USD, expended. Fighter sorties numbered over 1,000 dedicated intercept attempts at an operational cost of 500 Reichsmarks per sortie, adding another 500,000 Reichsmark. Searchlight batteries, more than 200 units deployed specifically for night defense, represented major investments in equipment and personnel. In total, over 5,000 German soldiers were assigned to counter night harassment raids, diverting critical personnel from frontline duty. The total German expenditure countering night witches exceeded 150 million Reichsmarks. Meanwhile, Soviet investment in the 588th Regiment was remarkably modest. 40 PO-2 aircraft at approximately $5,000 each totaled just $200,000. Ammunition costs were a fraction of defensive ammunition fired against them. Personnel consisted of 80 pilots, junction navigators with minimal ground crew, roughly 150 total personnel. The entire regiment represented a Soviet investment under $2 million USD. The cost ratio was staggering. Germans were spending at least 25.1 trying to stop what Soviets spent creating, while achieving 0 confirmed fighter kills on Night Witch aircraft. This represented perfect asymmetric warfare, minimal investment, producing maximum enemy resource drain. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency. Conservative estimates suggested Germans fired an average of 1,000 rounds, attempting to hit her aircraft during each mission. Her 852 missions therefore drew approximately 852,000 rounds of anti-aircraft fire. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, Germans spent over 42.6 million Reichsmark attempting to kill a single Soviet woman pilot. The result? She survived the war. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed approximately 130 tons of ammunition, 183 vehicles, 9 bridges, and numerous other infrastructure targets. The value of German material destroyed directly by her actions exceeded 75 million Reichsmarks. For perspective, the average United States Army Air Force bomber crew rotated home after 25 missions, considered a full combat tour. Nadezhda Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours of duty. She personally flew more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters combined. Her 852 missions made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal, delivering an extraordinary return on investment while forcing Germans to divert precious resources away from frontline operations. German high command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets. And Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German high command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation. On November 4, 1942, near Mozdok, a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft battery scored a direct hit on a PO-2 biplane during a night raid. The aircraft crashed in a controlled manner behind German lines, suggesting the pilot had attempted an emergency landing rather than being killed outright. At dawn, a recovery team located the downed aircraft in a field. Oberleutnant Werner Keller led the recovery operation, expecting to document another victory against Soviet harassment flights. The aircraft showed typical PO-2 configuration: wooden frame, canvas covering, small bomb rack under the lower wing. The pilot's body remained in the cockpit, slumped forward, having died from blood loss after shrapnel wounds to the chest. When Keller's team removed the leather flight helmet, confusion spread through the recovery crew. The pilot had shoulder-length dark hair pinned up under the helmet. The face, though bloodied, was unmistakably female. "Search the aircraft," Keller ordered, his voice betraying his disbelief. In the navigator's compartment, they found a logbook with female names recorded as pilot and navigator. The identification papers confirmed: Senior Lieutenant Yekaterina Ryabova, 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The logbook showed 322 completed missions. More puzzling was a photograph found in her pocket, a group of women in flight suits standing before a row of PO-2 biplanes. "This must be an isolated case," Keller noted in his initial report, possibly a propaganda effort or civilian instructor caught in combat. His conclusion reflected the impossibility, in German minds, of women serving as frontline combat pilots. 4 days later, a second PO-2 crashed after being damaged by searchlight-directed flak near Rostov. The recovery team, alerted by Keller's unusual finding, was prepared for another anomaly. Again, they found a female pilot, this time alive but severely wounded. Under interrogation before succumbing to her injury, the 20-year-old navigator confirmed what seemed inconceivable. The entire 588th Regiment consisted of female personnel. Every pilot, navigator, mechanic, and armorer was a woman. Keller's report reached Hauptmann Friedrich Stiller, his battalion commander, who initially dismissed it as Soviet disinformation. "The female is clearly attempting to confuse our intelligence," Stiller noted in his response. However, within a week, 3 additional confirmations arrived from different sectors. Another crashed aircraft with female casualty, captured documents from a temporary airfield, and reconnaissance photographs showing women in flight suits servicing Po-2 aircraft behind Soviet lines. The report escalated rapidly through the chain of command, from battalion to division, corps to army group. Each level responded with initial disbelief, followed by reluctant verification. By December 1942, Wehrmacht intelligence had confirmed the existence of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, an all-female unit operational since May 1942. The unit specifically targeted German positions with night harassment raids, the very night witches that had been disrupting German operations for months. At a high command briefing in Berlin, General Major Heinrich Müller presented the findings to a room of senior officers. "Gentlemen, the evidence is conclusive," he stated, displaying intelligence photos, captured documents, and prisoner testimony. "The Soviet 588th Night Bomber Regiment consists entirely of female personnel between ages 18 and 26. The officers examined verification data showing the same aircraft serial numbers appearing in multiple raid reports over months. Cross-referencing with Night Witch raid patterns confirmed the unthinkable. Women were responsible for the harassment that had cost millions in resources and countless nights of sleep. The revelation created a crisis within the Wehrmacht command structure. The initial response was widespread disbelief. Many officers refused to accept the evidence, demanding further verification despite the overwhelming. General Erich von Manstein reportedly threw the intelligence report across the room during a staff meeting, declaring it Bolshevik manipulation. For the elite Luftwaffe pilots, the humiliation cut deep. These were men who considered themselves the pinnacle of German military prowess, now being systematically outmaneuvered by women flying crop dusters. The propaganda implications were equally troubling. How could the Reich explain to the German public and troops that women were effectively disrupting Wehrmacht operations? The ideological conflict struck at the heart of Nazi doctrine about women's roles. According to official ideology, German women belonged in the domestic sphere, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, while Soviet females were now demonstrating lethal combat effectiveness. Most concerning was the practical question this raised. If the Reich had been so wrong about women's capabilities, what other fatal miscalculations might their ideology have produced? Reactions varied across command level. Some Luftwaffe pilots reportedly requested transfers rather than admit being bested by women night after night. Many officers insisted on referring to them only as Soviet Night Harassment Unit to avoid using female in official reports. Luftwaffe High Command actively suppressed information about the gender composition, fearing the morale impact on ground troops. Operational Order 4427, dated December 17, 1942, made this policy explicit. All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive is issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale. Frontline soldiers responded differently. A mixture of grudging respect and superstitious fear spread through the ranks. The nickname Nachthexen, Night Witches, proliferated rapidly among troops despite official discouragement. Some units began requesting dedicated anti-Night Witch resources, while others refused to acknowledge gender at all, focusing purely on the tactical threat. While German command struggled with the revelation, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause. When Germans discovered the regiment's composition, she had already completed 641 of her eventual 852 missions. On the very night General Major Müller delivered his briefing in Berlin, she was targeting a German fuel depot near Krasnodar, unaware that her existence had become a crisis for enemy high command. The raid destroyed 4 storage tanks and disabled 3 supply trucks, delaying fuel distribution to German armored units for 3 critical days. Unlike some of her comrades, Popova harbored no special satisfaction in the Germans' discovery. "We didn't fly to prove women could fight," she later told a war correspondent. "We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bomb." For her, each mission simply brought the Soviet Union one step closer to victory, and her personal tally one number closer to her eventual 852. The discovery changed nothing operationally. The night witches continued flying, and Germans continued dying. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners that revealed the psychological impact of the night witch. During extensive debriefings conducted between 1945 and 1946, interrogators asked former Wehrmacht personnel about their Eastern Front experiences, particularly regarding night operations. When the topic of night witches arose, interrogators noted an unexpected consistency in responses across hundreds of interviews. Even hardened SS officers showed visible discomfort discussing these encounters, a mixture of lingering fear, grudging respect, and residual humiliation. Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann, a Ju-88 night fighter pilot with NJG-4, Night Fighter Group 4, captured near Prague in May 1945, provided particularly revealing testimony. "We received orders to intercept these aircraft in October 1942. Command didn't tell us they were women. We only learned after the war ended. I attempted interception 17 times, 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for engagement. My stall warnings would activate every time I tried to match their speed. It was humiliating. You train for years to master the Ju-88. You face British Lancaster bombers. You understand air combat. Then a wooden biplane makes you look foolish. When I learned after surrender they were women, The transcript notes a long pause. "I had no word. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't let us. Gender was irrelevant. They had beaten the laws of aerodynamics itself." Hauptmann Werner Schultz, who commanded a flak battery in eastern Ukraine, offered equally candid admission. "My battery fired an estimated 37,000 rounds at these aircraft between August 1942 and January 1944. We achieved perhaps 3 or 4 confirmed hits across 2 years. They would approach with engines loud. We would prepare. Then, silent. We would fire at where we thought they were, but we were shooting at ghosts. The sound would return after bombs exploded. Psychological effect on my men was severe. We feared the silence more than the bomb. Learning they were women only added to the sense that we had underestimated everything about this enemy." A pattern emerged across these testimonies. Nearly all mentioned the eerie silence preceding attacks and its psychological impact. Many described failed interceptions due to the speed differential in similar technical terms, suggesting this was a widely understood phenomenon among Luftwaffe pilots. The universal shock upon learning the pilot's gender was consistent, though responses varied from continued dismissal. Soviet propaganda exaggerated female involvement to reluctant acknowledgement made no difference. They were effective regardless. The phrase, "we couldn't catch what we couldn't match in speed," appeared in various forms across dozens of statements, suggesting it had become a common explanation among German airmen. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, who served with the 16th Panzer Division near Stalingrad, provided one such account. "There was one aircraft we learned to recognize, had distinctive pattern of repair patches on the lower left wing and fuselage. This aircraft appeared over our positions at least twice weekly. We began calling it the persistent one because it would return even after heavy fire. I witnessed this aircraft's attacks 14 times personally. On January 23, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot with perfect accuracy. On February 7th, it hit our command post, killing 3 officers including our intelligence captain. After the war, I learned from Soviet records this was likely Lieutenant Popova. She had flown over 852 missions. We never came close to shooting her down. She was untouchable." Popova herself learned about these testimonies years after the war. When shown translations of German statements mentioning her aircraft, she displayed characteristic pragmatism. Of course they remembered certain aircraft, she noted. We had favorite targets too. The ones with the most valuable supplies, the best protected command center. They were just coordinates on our maps. But I suppose we became identifiable to them as well. Throughout the period when Germans were capturing her comrades and learning about the regiment, she maintained her relentless mission tempo. By war's end, her 852 mission, including her record-breaking nights of multiple sorties, became documented not just in Soviet records, but in German testimony, the reluctant acknowledgement by the enemy of her devastating effectiveness. We did what needed doing, she reflected years later. Whether they respected us or feared us or were humiliated by us was their concern. Our concern was victory. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The night witches weren't anomalies or propaganda. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible. Her 852 combat missions represented an achievement almost beyond comprehension in aviation terms. Over 3 years of combat operations from May 1942 through May 1945, she accumulated approximately 1,300 flight hours in her wooden PO2 biplane, dropping an estimated 90 tons of bombs on German positions. She survived the entire war without being shot down, despite facing intense anti-aircraft fire on nearly every mission. For her extraordinary service, she received the Soviet Union's highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union, plus 3 Orders of the Red Banner, the Order of the Red Star, and numerous campaign medals. The 852 missions she flew exceeded the lifetime totals of entire German fighter squadrons. For perspective, this represented a sustained operational tempo of approximately 28 missions per month, every month for 3 years, including during the brutal Russian winters when temperatures in her open cockpit regularly plunged to -40 degrees. She continued flying even after suffering frostbite to her feet and hands that left permanent scarring. On one occasion, she flew despite a concussion from a previous night's crash landing, refusing medical leave when her regiment was short-staffed. The physical toll was immense. After the war, medical examinations revealed permanent hearing damage from thousands of hours of engine noise just inches behind her head. Her hands bore scars from manipulating frozen metal controls night after night. More invisible was the psychological resilience required, knowing that each of her 852 takeoffs might be her last, yet climbing into the cockpit again and again while watching comrades disappear. Of the original 40 women who formed the regiment in 1942, 32 perished. Popova's survival through all 852 missions was a statistical anomaly that defied explanation. To understand the magnitude of these numbers, context matters. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40-60 missions in their entire careers before being lost or rotated to training duty. American bomber crews in the 8th Air Force were sent home after 25 missions, a number considered the maximum psychological limit before combat effectiveness deteriorated. Popova's 852 missions equated to 34 complete American combat tours. Even among other Soviet pilots, her record stood apart. The average Soviet male bomber pilot completed between 150 to 300 missions during the entire war. Within her own regiment, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the average was 500 to 600 missions. Popova exceeded this by over 250 sorties. The scale of her contribution becomes clearer in aggregate terms. Her 852 missions represented more flights than some entire bomber groups combined. With each mission averaging approximately 90 minutes, she spent the equivalent of 80 continuous days in the air, always at night, always under fire. The 90 tons of bombs she delivered destroyed an estimated 17 ammunition dumps, 2 railway bridges, 9 fuel depots, and dozens of vehicles and command posts. German records captured after the war attributed approximately 800 casualties directly to her aircraft's raids. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to deploy women in combat roles. Over 3 years of operations, the regiment flew approximately 24,000 combat sorties and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions. Their efforts directly resulted in an estimated 5,000 German casualties and destroyed hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, and countless infrastructure targets. Operating continuously from May 1942 until May 1945, they maintained this tempo despite losing 32 of their approximately 80 personnel, a 60% casualty rate that still remarkably translated to a 96.8% survival rate per mission. For comparison, conventional Soviet bomber units experienced only a 40 to a 60% survival rate overall. Their cost effectiveness proved the regiment's greatest value. The entire unit, aircraft, personnel, maintenance, and ammunition, represented a Soviet investment of under $2 million. Conservative estimates place the damage they inflicted at over $50 million in destroyed German material. More telling was the German expenditure attempting to counter them. Approximately 125 million Reichsmarks in anti-aircraft ammunition, fighter sorties, searchlight batteries, and personnel. The cost ratio was staggering. For every ruble the Soviets invested in the Night Witch, Germans spent 60 attempting to stop them. Despite this massive investment, German forces failed to achieve a single confirmed aerial kill of a Night Witch aircraft by fighter interception. Almost all Night Witch losses came from ground fire, not air combat. The stall-speed paradox remained unsolved throughout the war. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value. The Night Witch's psychological impact extended far beyond physical damage. German troops suffering from sleep deprivation made critical errors in daytime operation. Over 5,000 German personnel were tied down in dedicated anti-Night Witch air defense roles, soldiers who could have otherwise served on front lines. Supply lines required constant rerouting, as Night Witches systematically targeted predictable routes, forcing longer and more vulnerable alternatives. Their very existence provided invaluable propaganda, showcasing Soviet women's contribution to the war effort, boosting civilian morale during the darkest periods. Perhaps most significantly, they exposed fundamental flaws in German intelligence and doctrine. The assumption that women couldn't pilot combat aircraft had blinded German analysts to the threat until it was too late. They became a model for asymmetric warfare, demonstrating how seemingly inferior forces could achieve disproportionate impact through innovative tactics. Marshal Zhukov reportedly noted in his memoir, "The Night Witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them." The 588th Regiment proved that in warfare, technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and determination can overcome engineering. Nadezhda Popova's 852 mission embodied this principle. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced a different kind of challenge, returning to civilian life after years of nightly combat. Initially celebrated with her Hero of the Soviet Union medal, she participated in victory parades and gave speeches about women's contributions to the war effort. Yet the transition proved difficult. After 852 combat missions, ordinary civilian existence seemed strangely quiet. "I sometimes woke at night reaching for my flight suit," she later admitted. The silence was more unsettling than any anti-aircraft fire. She remained in aviation, working as a flight instructor at the Kiev Flight School, where she had first learned to fly before the war. Marriage followed in 1946 to another decorated pilot, Semyon Kharlamov, with whom she had a son. Unlike many veterans, Popova spoke openly about her experience, feeling a duty to preserve the memory of fallen comrades. She maintained close relationships with surviving Night Witches, participating in annual reunions until health constraints intervened. The Soviet system recognized her achievements with multiple decorations beyond her wartime medals: the Order of Lenin, the Order of October Revolution, and numerous commemorative awards. Her missions featured prominently in official Soviet military history, though the focus often emphasized collective achievement over individual heroism. Like many Soviet war heroes, recognition fluctuated with the political climate. Stalin's personal disinterest in female combatants meant the night witches received less prominence than male fighter aces during his lifetime. Nadezhda Popova continued advocating for military women's recognition throughout her life. She rose to become a deputy in the Supreme Soviet of Ukraine, using her position to improve veterans' benefits. She died on July 8, 2013, at age 91 in Moscow. In her hometown of Shabanovka, now part of Ukraine, a small museum preserves her medals, photographs, and flight logbook documenting her 852 mission. Russian military academies still study the night witch's tactics as examples of asymmetric advantage against technologically superior forces. For decades, the night witches remained virtually unknown in the West. During the Cold War, Western military historians dismissed accounts of their achievements as Soviet propaganda, exaggerating female contributions for ideological purposes. The stall speed paradox and other tactical innovations went unstudied in Western Air Force. Only during Glasnost in the late 1980s did more complete records become available to non-Soviet research. The 1990s saw the first serious Western historical accounts based on newly accessible Soviet archives and surviving night witch testimony. By the 2000s, several documentaries and books brought their story to Western audiences. German war records and POW testimonies, which had been available but overlooked, suddenly gained new significance as they independently verified Soviet accounts. What Western military analysts had dismissed as propaganda was revealed as documented history, often understated rather than exaggerated by Soviet sources. Modern recognition has expanded significantly. The Central Russian Air Force Museum near Moscow features a prominent night witches exhibit, including one of the few surviving PO-2 aircraft. Monuments stand in several Russian cities, with the most significant in Rostov-on-Don, where the regiment was first formed. Streets bearing Popova's name exist in Moscow, Kiev, and her native region. Documentary films like Night Witches, The Forgotten War Hero, 2008, brought international attention to their story. In 2013, the year of Popova's death, the Russian Federation issued a commemorative stamp featuring her aircraft, recognizing the woman who had completed more combat missions than any female pilot in history. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the Night Witches transcends its historical moment, offering lessons that remain relevant decades later. In warfare, they demonstrated how asymmetric tactics can defeat technological superiority when applied with innovation and persistence. Their psychological impact often exceeded their physical damage, proving that fear and disruption can be as effective as destruction. They showed that innovation frequently matters more than resources, especially when constraints force creative solutions. The German underestimation of the night witches revealed how prejudice creates vulnerability. By dismissing female pilots flying outdated aircraft, German commanders blinded themselves to a genuine threat until it was too late. The presumed weaknesses of the PO-2, its canvas construction, slow speed, and primitive design, became its greatest strengths in actual combat conditions. This lesson echoes through military history. Never dismiss a threat based on preconceptions about who should be dangerous. Popova's 852 missions required extraordinary resilience. Each takeoff carried the knowledge that it might be her last, yet she continued, night after night, year after year. The physical toll of open cockpit flight in Russian winter and the psychological burden of lost comrades would have broken most pilots. Her survival required skill, luck, and an unyielding refusal to quit that transcended normal human limitation. The engineering lessons proved equally significant. The PO-2's simple design, denigrated by Germans, outlasted complex German aircraft, specifically because of its simplicity. The night witches understood their operational environment and exploited physics the Germans considered irrelevant. Their silent glide tactic evolved from necessity rather than sophisticated technology. They proved that the right tool for the job isn't always the most advanced. Sometimes it's the most appropriate. When Nadezhda Popova climbed into her PO-2 for the last of her 852 missions, she represented everything German military doctrine had dismissed as irrelevant. That wooden biplane, a flying coffin in German assessment, had survived when sophisticated metal fighters had fallen. The women that German officers had mocked as incompetent had outlasted those same officers. The Germans had calculated aircraft specification, firepower ratio, and technological advantages, but missed the human factor entirely. They ridiculed crop dusters flown by schoolgirls while those same women systematically dismantled German logistics. In the conflict between physics and will, between technology and determination, Nadezhda Popova proved that the greatest weapon in warfare isn't necessarily the fastest plane or the biggest bomb. It's the enemy you underestimate until it's too late.